So tonight we will hear from Jack. His career in Scottish politics began in 1984 as a councillor in the Stirling District Council. He was then elected as a member of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. He became Minister for Education, Europe and External Relations in 2000, quite a portfolio, and finally serving as First Minister for Scotland from 2001 to 2007. And he was, incidentally, the first Minister who didn't serve his apprenticeship at Westminster. We'll then hear some closing remarks from Margaret Jay, who was Leader of the House of Lords from 1999 to 2001, and will be able to offer a Westminster perspective on devolution. So, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot claim to have been a major player in the pre-devolution debate, but I was with John Major throughout the 1992 election campaign. And I remember very well being with him in Edinburgh. John was quite fierce on devolution. What he said was this: a new tax-raising parliament cannot be seen as a simple bolt-on extra to the Constitution. It might start there, but it would never end there. Labour, in their self-seeking way, are playing thoughtlessly upon grievances in Scotland. For short-term advantage, they're prepared to do long-term damage. They portray as a panacea what is in fact a Pandora's box. Open that box and the demon of separation would be let loose. We should not see it caged again so easily. So there we are. Jack. That is your cue. Jack.
I'm not sure if I came out of that Pandora's box. I'm not sure what that means for that prediction. Thank you very much for that introduction and challenge, perhaps, at the end. And thanks to the Lord Speaker for this opportunity to reflect back on 20 years of devolution of Home Rule for Scotland. It's been an interesting month reflecting back on those times, on the build-up to 1999 and everything that's happened since, and hopefully tonight I can do it justice. Thanks also to Baroness Jay for replying. I think she will have memories not just of 1999, but maybe also of 1979, and not all those memories will be great memories, I would imagine. So I am very grateful to her for taking up that challenge. And I'd like to particularly thank Francis Thompson from the Lord Speaker's office, who has done an immense amount of work to make this event tonight happen, and has been a joy to work with over the last few weeks. And thanks to all of you for coming. I hope that your evening is enjoyable and worthwhile. And also thanks to the people of Motherwell and Wishaw, who gave me the opportunity to serve in this new Parliament and be part of that historic occasion back in May 1999. I'll be eternally grateful to them. It wasn't an area that I knew well. I was son of a sheep farmer, a shepherd from the Isle of Arran. I had never really lived in an industrial town before. I represented that area for 12 years. Got to know the people very, very well, and will always be very proud to have been their representative. Devolution for Scotland, in some ways John Major was right. Devolution for Scotland was the opening of a box. It was a truly radical transformation, probably the most radical transformation in our system of government since universal suffrage. And it was a change that was a long time coming, and it's still really 20 years on in its early stages. I was very struck that first summer by one of the things that Donald Dewar said on the formal opening day on the 1st of July, when he said that the Parliament was about more than just politics and laws. It was about who we are and how we carried ourselves. And in many ways, I think that has been true over these last 20 years. But on the first day in May 1999, and we're almost exactly 20 years from that first day, it certainly felt historic. And we felt, I think collectively, all of us, from all parties, all backgrounds, we felt a real commitment to try and find Scottish solutions to some of those old Scottish problems that had plagued our nation for so long. The first member had been elected on the 6th of May. Tom McCabe, who was unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Tom had been the leader of South Lanarkshire Council, had a very close relationship with the leader of the chief executive of the council and the local chief constable, and was able to arrange Sunderland style, if you know what I mean, the police cars and the motorcycles who would take the ballot boxes to the town hall most quickly and make sure that he was elected the first MSP in the new elected parliament. And all of us thought, I wish we had thought of that first. Tom went on, of course, to be a real driving force behind the smoking ban legislation and certainly left his legacy in Scotland. On the 12th of May, we took our oaths, and most of us were fairly nervous. If we're going to get the words wrong on this great historic day, then you would be remembered for that. But the iconic image of the day, I think, if I remember rightly, was Tommy Sheridan with his clenched fist making his early mark in the Parliament. Someone who was certainly known over the years that followed for his moments of protest and symbolism. But those nerves and hopes and expectations settled during the course of the day. The first point, those of you who served in Westminster in the 70s, 80s and 90s will not be surprised to know that the first point of order was moved by Dennis Canavan, who is a legend in that respect in Westminster. But I suspect that was only because George Fuchs wasn't there. He might have beaten him to it. Later that day, Lord Steele became the first presiding officer of the Parliament and then presided over our business for 4 years. The next day, we elected our First Minister, Donald Dewar, the father of the Parliament, who had done so much over the years to campaign for the Parliament and to help make it happen, and of course was absolutely the right person to lead us in that first 18 months before he so tragically died the following year. A week later, our first real innovation. We elected the Scottish law officers. Lord Hardy, Andrew Hardy, and Colin Boyd, later to be Lord Colin Boyd, were elected as Lord Advocate and Solicitor General by the Parliament, recommended to the Queen, and took their new offices in the Cabinet. And the next day, the ministers were elected again for nomination to the Queen, young and old, inexperienced and very experienced. And I found myself as Minister for Finance. I'd come a long way from that sheep farm in the Isle of Arran, and my first vote, which was cast in 1979 in the then failed devolution referendum of March 1979. And Donald told the Queen that night, when she was introduced to the new cabinet, that the reason he'd appointed me was because I was a maths teacher and possibly the only person in the cabinet who could count well enough to be Minister for Finance. I took that as a compliment. A lot had happened in that 20 years. I had indeed cast my first vote in March 79, been, as so many were, disappointed by the result at the time, and had spent much of the 20 years that followed trying to make sure not only that we maintained the momentum towards creating a parliament and some home rule for Scotland, but also that we did it right in terms of the scheme, the plan, the public consent that was necessary to make it truly the settled will of the people of Scotland. And there were some key moments along the way. Devolution didn't happen in 1999 out the blue. There was a historic moment in 1989. Lord Bruce was very heavily involved in with Donald Dewar when 52 of Scotland's 72 MPs and a variety of people from Civic Scotland and other elected offices signed the historic Claim of Right, which asserted the sovereign right of the people of Scotland to choose the system of government that they preferred, and then to agree and then secure that scheme. That the Constitutional Convention that came from that, the not exactly all-party body, but certainly cross-party body that was there to try and build consent, led very ably by Lord Robertson and Lord Wallace, agreed on the 30th of November 1995, the scheme that was then to be implemented. And I know that Lord Robertson is particularly proud of the fact that the one thing in the Labour manifesto in 1997 and then implemented by the Labour government after 1997 that didn't go through Tony Blair's policy churn in advance of 97 to have a party stamp on it was this all-party agreement in Scotland that was to be implemented after the election and bring devolution following a successful referendum that itself took place on the 11th of September, with 75% of the Scottish population voted to say yes. And we weren't doing this alone. In Northern Ireland the year before, 1998, there had been elections to the new Northern Ireland Assembly that had come out of the Good Friday Agreement, and in Cardiff, of course, in Wales, a very close vote had secured an assembly for Wales that I think at the time might have been controversial. It's become much more part of Welsh national life and culture over these 20 years. And then following that, the year later, it was the first elected mayor for London. The first thing, though, that I was really impressed with was the work that had gone on between 97 and 99. Incredible effort and rigour by the civil service in Scotland and the ministers at the Scottish Office to design the working of the new Parliament, to make sure that it was up and running within 2 years of the referendum itself. Donald, of course, had agreed a site and a design for a new building that was to become controversial, but that was a momentum that was already well underway. There were a lot of talk about a new style for the Parliament. A constitutional steering group had been established under the leadership of Henry MacLeish and had agreed new ways of working. The Parliament was to be more European in its style, more consensual. I'm not too sure that that actually worked out. And the Parliament was to be filled with new people. And most of the parties did try to attract new people in from different walks of life, and the Labour Party in particular managed to secure half men, half women in its first group in the new Parliament, which was a huge step forward at the time. But the work of the civil service, maybe not often recognised at that time, I think was one of the great achievements by the civil service in modern times, to make sure that the Parliament was ready and that its procedures and powers could begin on the 1st of July. Following all these activities in May, the first private members' bill, the first speech, the first question time, the new powers were acquired formally on the 1st of July. The Queen presented a mace to the Parliament, and Donald Dewar made that incredible, historic speech where he spoke of the rare privilege in an old nation of opening a new Parliament. He spoke about the words that were on the mace: wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. The simplest of values, honourable aspirations for this new form of democracy born on the cusp of a new century. And it really felt like history was being made. And then followed turbulent years. We had 3 First Ministers in 2.5 years. Scrutiny that Scottish politicians had never experienced before on a level that was very, very difficult to deal with. Destroyed some people, and I hope in others perhaps gave them strength to carry on and build from there and make the Parliament a success. People who were inexperienced making mistakes along the way, but again, they were our own mistakes, and perhaps we would learn from them. Although I have reflected over recent months that perhaps the chaos that we felt we were in the middle of then, is nothing compared to what we might be experiencing somewhere else at the moment. 20 years on, though, how do we assess this? That's the main purpose of tonight's lecture. Well, I don't measure the success of Scottish devolution or the Parliament and its creation by individual spending decisions or by the individual scandals that have happened along the way. I certainly don't measure it by division, because there is division in every Western democracy today and disillusion with politics and politicians. I measure it by the direction of the country. I don't mean the constitutional direction, but the sense of confidence and character, the quality of life and the belief in our democratic system of governance. And I think in those respects, Scotland is a better place today than it was 20 years ago. If we look back 20 years ago, in 1999, for example, Scotland had an out-of-date, oppressive system of land ownership that had never been changed. Was never going to be, time for it was never going to be found here at Westminster to make the massive reforms led by Lord Wallace that we made in that first period of the Parliament. We had a creaking criminal justice system where politicians still appointed their friends to be judges, where we had victims finding their cases had been lost because of the time it was taking the police and the prosecutors to get them to court. We had in Glasgow, the most violent city in some years, in the world, certainly in Europe. We had the second worst recycling record in a beautiful country like Scotland, the second worst recycling record in Europe, just behind Turkey. We were known as the ill health capital of the world, where Scots, certainly in certain parts of Scotland, died far too young for a developed democracy. Our manufacturing, which had been built up again in the 90s under the leadership of Lord Lang, was already starting to disappear into Eastern Europe and Asia. But most of all, we were still a country where people got out to get on. That was the most significant thing about the Scotland that I had grown up in and spent my adult life in until then. People would leave Scotland in order to get on. The population of Scotland had dropped systematically since the mid-1970s, since 1974, was still dropping. And we were, in many ways, as a country, too white, too occasionally prejudiced, still in a historic decline. And that was the biggest challenge for the Parliament, was could we turn that around and have a much more positive national direction. And I do believe that despite all the divisions, and the divisions have been deep since the 2014 referendum in Scotland, not any less deep than they are in the UK since the Brexit referendum of 2016, that we're more connected, I think we're more confident, we're a more attractive place to people to come and live and work and study and visit, and we have a rising population. We've had a rising population every year since 2004. So in order to assess the Parliament in more detail, you have to look, I think, at three areas. Has it passed good law? Is that the primary purpose of a Parliament? Fill that democratic deficit, pass laws in Scotland. Has it spoken for Scotland at the right times and in the right way? And has it held government and public bodies to account? And my assessment would be yes, mostly. Nobody's perfect. Nothing's right all the time. But I hope in the examples I can give tonight, I can show that broadly, these great challenges for the Parliament have been carried through. Parliament's passed budgets every year for 20 years. People said it would be very difficult to make a proportional Parliament work with coalitions or minority governments because of the proportional electoral system. But every year on time, the Parliament has passed a budget. But 285 acts of the Parliament have been passed in 20 years, covering a wide range of very important reforming legislation. We've seen land reforms to transform that system of feudal land ownership, but also the creation of national parks. A Scot had gone to North America, invented and created national parks. We'd never had one in Scotland. Today we have successful national parks, but also greater community land ownership and more vibrant rural communities as a result of the reforms that were undertaken then. The reform of our criminal justice system, new rights for victims, a more independent process for appointing judges, and other significant changes led primarily by Lord Boyd and then by Eilish Angelini as Lord Advocates, really transformed our justice system in a way that I think has created more confidence in it today. New rights for parents and for children with special educational needs, new rights for vulnerable adults, new protections for the environment. The creation of a national system for funding and supporting our national arts companies, which hadn't existed in Scotland before, and they're now attracting talent, the best talent from around the world, and making their name on the world stage with greater certainty and support from Scottish public life. The creation, Lord Watson, I think, pioneered this bill through the Parliament, the creation of a national theatre for Scotland, something that we'd wanted for decades and has been award-winning in its work since then. And then, crucially, the moment the Parliament came of age, I think, the ban on smoking in public places. It sounds like a relatively minor measure. And to mention it now, particularly to quite a lot of young people in the audience, it probably seems strange that people once smoked in restaurants and bars and other public places, including airplane toilets, which I find astonishing if I look back on it. But the ban on smoking in public places was a landmark piece of legislation for a lot of reasons. It certainly made a significant difference to the health of Scotland and the attractiveness of Scotland. but it was the first time the Parliament had passed an act which was genuinely unpopular with a very large section of the population. So therefore it was the first time that in passing an act of the Parliament had really challenged people in Scotland to accept its authority. And when the smoking ban came into place on the 26th of March 2006, it was remarkable to see that across Scotland there were no incidents, not one incident anywhere, that provoked the need to involve a police officer or anybody in any position of authority. And that signal that people in Scotland had accepted that the Parliament had done something they didn't necessarily agree with, that they would accept in practice, was the moment, I think, when the new Legislative Parliament really came of age. And I think, therefore, in terms of legislation, there have been good years and bad years. There's been a couple of examples, I think, maybe over recent years of ill-thought-out legislation. But in the main, the Parliament has done its job. It was set up to legislate, and it has been legislating. And for that, I think those who've served in it should be very proud. Second area is, has the Parliament provided a voice for Scotland? Has it spoken for Scotland and for the people of Scotland? And in this area, I would say not just spoken for, but perhaps also I think there's a need for Parliament sometimes and governments to speak to populations as well as speak for them. And there have been some very emotional moments. Obviously, when Donald Dewar died, that was a particular moment where the Parliament was at the centre of the nation's grief. But a year later, when Henry McLeish spoke in the Parliament after the bombings in New York, particularly as there was a very close connection between the Scottish fire services and the fire services in New York, I think the Parliament certainly spoke for the nation that day. I think Nicola Sturgeon, in the Brexit referendum in 2016, spoke for Scotland, as did many of the other leaders of other parties in Holyrood. And we've also spoken for Scotland in promoting Scotland as a place that people should be interested in. I was acutely aware when I became First Minister that the most recent projection from the Registrar General for Scotland was that Scotland's population would drop below 5 million potentially by 2009. And I thought that would be, all my life Scotland had a population just over 5 million, and I thought that the impact of that on our national consciousness would be dramatic, demoralising almost. So we set out through the Fresh Talent Initiative and promoting Scotland around the world and promoting Scotland throughout the UK as a place to study and work and live and visit, to try and turn that around and create an increasing larger population, more diverse population as a result. It is inconceivable that that initiative could have happened prior to devolution. Can you imagine a situation where in a UK cabinet, the Secretary of State for one of the nations goes out on a limb with a different immigration policy to promote immigration, not just from inside the UK, but elsewhere in migration, not just from elsewhere in the UK, but from elsewhere in the world into that particular territory. And that was the voice of Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament being used in a new and innovative way that was very different. It was used in other ways as well to promote Scottish sporting events, the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games, but that was the big one, where a position that could never have been taken prior to devolution was taken and has become a success. But the Parliament, I think, has also, and the government in Scotland have also spoken inside Scotland. And issues like sectarianism, for example, which had been a bit of a curse in Scotland over a long period of time, religious bigotry, never really been a topic that had been taken up by Scottish politicians before. The Parliament and the Scottish Government took a stand on that and brought people together, used the convening power of the Scottish Parliament to bring together people who'd never met before. The first summit that I held, I introduced the Cardinal to the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge. They had never been in the same room. Never been in the same room. And neither of their predecessors had ever been in the same room down through the centuries. And the convening power of a parliament and a government at home in Scotland meant that I think we were able to take those kind of initiatives as well. So I think the Parliament spoke for Scotland, but it also spoke to Scotland and tried to change Scotland, make Scotland a better place. It also brought government closer to the people of Scotland in many ways, and I've very practical example of that that I think is topical nowadays here in London. But I'm also very conscious that in Scotland, you never really get far away from the people. You know, I talk about how we get closer to the people, but actually, if you're a Scottish politician, you never really get far away from the people, and you're regularly reminded that you can't. The last public engagement that I had as First Minister was in a big school in East Renfrewshire, just outside Glasgow. Fancy new school building, we were very proud of it. It was a key marginal constituency. I was out there doing my very best to promote this new investment in the area. We had a wonderful ceremony where the pupils performed, parents, local civic leaders and others in the audience. The whole event had gone really well, and plenty of cameras and radio in attendance, and lots of publicity was going to follow. And I was taken after the event on the stage, taken to the head teacher's room to do a radio interview. And there was a little boy sitting outside the head teacher's room on a chair. In every school in the world, there's a little boy sitting outside the head teacher's room. And that school teacher background of mine kicked in, and I just couldn't resist the temptation to talk to this boy. Perhaps a little cocky, if I can use that phrase about myself, having had such a good day so far that day. So I stopped and asked the boy why he was sitting there, why he was waiting for the head teacher. And he didn't look up. He murmured something into his chest, and I got a bit overconfident and decided I would push the issue. So I pushed him again. Why are you here? Have you been in trouble this morning? And he went, yes, I've been in trouble this morning. I'm waiting for the head teacher. And I thought, what can I say to this boy that, as First Minister, that's going to make him think about his behaviour in the future? I'm not a teacher anymore. I can't give him a punishment, so maybe I can just make a threat of some kind. So I said, do you realise that I'm in charge of all the prisons in Scotland? And he looked up at me and he said, did you meet my big brother? So it was very hard as a Scottish politician not to be grounded when you meet characters like that. A month later, actually, just as I was leaving office, I had a lunchtime curry with Lord Reid. I don't know if he's here this evening, but Lord Reid and I had a place that we met occasionally. No plotting, of course, ever went on there, but it's a curry restaurant in Lanarkshire. And we both had a liking, after we'd had a curry, for some plain ice cream as the dessert. And John ordered this ice cream, and the waitress, older woman who was the waitress, came out with ice cream that had little sprinkly things on top of it. And John said, oh, no, I didn't ask for that. I asked for plain vanilla ice cream. And she said, just eat it. So we never really got above our station in Scotland. We weren't allowed to. But I think Parliament did bring, at times, the politicians closer to the people. And I think knife crime is a very good example of that, very topical here in London today. The initiative that was launched in Scotland in 2005 and has been maintained both in Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland in successive administrations since, to pull together the police, the health services, the education service, the local authorities and the national authorities, the prosecutors, all together to try and deal with the situation in Glasgow at that time, which was the knife attack capital of the world. And today has seen a remarkable, I think, 75% drop in the number of injuries and deaths through that kind of violent assault 15 years later. That kind of that would have been possible under the old Scottish office, but the momentum created by bringing, I think, politicians and people and authorities closer together helped us take that kind of initiative as well. So politicians, yes, were closer to the people. But I do think it's in that third area of accountability where perhaps there is still more work to be done. It's a new parliament, new procedures. People are still, even 20 years on, I think, perhaps, finding their way. There have been innovations. The petition system was a great innovation that has given people an opportunity to have a voice at the centre of their parliament. It's great to see a children's educational centre here at Westminster, and of course there was one in the Scottish Parliament in fairly early on in the second term. But at the same time, though, I think this new Parliament partly because of the discipline of the political parties and the lack of dissent from backbenchers in the Parliament, partly because of the proportional electoral system, where so many members owe their place to a party list and not necessarily their constituency. And maybe just because the Parliament itself is new, smaller, closer to home, sometimes I think life can be too cosy for ministers. I thought this when I was First Minister and a minister, and I believe it's similar today. I think to some extent the Parliament has sucked the life and the voice out of local government in Scotland, and there's a need to find a way to re-energise that voice, because it was always an important part of our national framework. And there's certainly not enough cross-party dissent, which can be, as we see at the moment, perhaps in another place, occasionally a bit destructive, but can also be a healthy thing in a parliament and a democracy. And I think we need a bit more of that in Holyrood. So I think 20 years on, it would be a good time to look again, not at the principles of the proportional electoral system, but perhaps at the way that it works in practice. Look again, perhaps, at how the powers and the voice of local government could be refreshed and renewed for this era, and maybe find a way of giving more power to the backbenchers, more spontaneity in the debates. Perhaps take innovations from Westminster, like elected committee chairs, which I think have been a great success in the House of Commons. The other area that I think does need reflection after 20 years is the other end of the M1 here in London. There was that remarkable transfer of power. In many ways, a remarkable thing for a government to do 2 years in, the Labour government, to give away so much power, particularly to give it away to a proportional parliament that wasn't going to have a majority of your MSPs in it. So that radical transformation of power away, and the building of this democratic parliament and the development of its experience and record in Scotland, I'm not sure has been replicated here by reflection in the UK system of government over the last 20 years. And I certainly, for one, I regret the fact that there has not been over that 20 years more change in the system here in Whitehall and Westminster to reflect the fact that power has been devolved in practice increasingly to both Edinburgh and Cardiff, but also in principle and occasionally in practice to Belfast. I think there's been a lack of, not just a lack of change in the system of government, there's been a lack of interchange between the civil service in Edinburgh and London. I'm not sure if that's the case with Cardiff and Belfast, but it's certainly been the case between Edinburgh and London, where those who were going to be the high-flying civil servants in Edinburgh in the past would have served time in the big London departments, in the Cabinet Office or the Treasury or elsewhere, and vice versa. People would have had that experience, and that's not really the case. I worried about it as Minister for Finance, responsible for the civil service back in 1999-2000, and I don't believe that's ever been properly tackled. And I would like to see, for example, a system where senior civil servants, both in Whitehall and in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast, would have an obligation to, at some point in their career, spend time seconded to the other level of government. I think it would be really healthy for British democracy and the civil service if that was the case. And then thirdly, I think there's been a failure to seize the opportunity of Brexit. Brexit brings all kinds of challenges and difficulties, but it may have provided an opportunity to reflect on the UK system of government, the relationship between the centre and the nations. And I was struck, very struck, in looking back to May 1999 by the fact that Lord Mackay asked a question on the same day as we were taking the oath, on the 12th of May 1999. He asked a question of the then Minister for the Scotland Office here in the House of Lords as to why there was going to be no change at the Scotland Office and the Secretary of State and the Ministers were still going to stay in place. And Lord Mackay is known, I think, in this House for his wisdom. And he was very wise on that occasion. And 20 years later, pretty much the same situation is still in place. So I think 20 years on, yes, there is a need to continue to review and reform and refresh in Edinburgh, but I think much more so that is required here. And to me, there are three big reforms that would make a huge difference. I think the case for having territorial secretaries of state is long gone. I know that Prime Minister Blair tried to change that back in 2003 and didn't quite secure the support of all his colleagues, but it seems to me that in 2019 there is no longer a case for having Secretaries of State for Scotland and Wales, and even actually probably for Northern Ireland in the current cabinet. I would far rather see those posts replaced by a powerful figure at the heart of government, a Secretary of State for the nations and regions, who might even be the first Secretary of State in the cabinet, who would sit alongside the Chancellor and the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary as a powerful figure, speaking for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the English regions and the cities, but also a little bit more detached, I think, than the territorial secretaries who tend to get caught up too much in the politics. Secondly, I think there needs to be a serious attempt at cross-party talks in relation to the future of the House of Lords. The proposals around for a Senate of the Nations and Regions or other reforms, which I think are very welcome, but I think the lesson of Scotland is you shouldn't make this scale of constitutional change by a one-party initiative alone. I think building a cross-party consensus for a reform, debating it openly and properly over a few years would be the right way ahead. But I do believe that a Senate of the Nations and Regions, perhaps further down the road, would be a powerful way of involving the rest of the country, engaging with them much better. Some of the lessons we have to learn, I think, from the Brexit referendum. And finally, I think as a result of Brexit, we need to find a new way of governing, sometimes where we share the sovereignty. The devolution settlements have been quite clear since 1999. Those elements that have not been reserved are devolved. That was the clarity of the legislation. But we're now in slightly more muddy waters. One of the reasons that could be so clear was that areas where sovereignty might be shared were actually being dealt with by Brussels. And that might yet not be the case. And if it's not going to be the case, then I think there is definitely a need to look at the creation of European-style councils of ministers for these islands, where ministers in the central government and in the devolved governments in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast meet together with co-decision making, either by majorities or unanimity or some other formula, in areas like fishing, which affect the whole country, but are primarily are devolved responsibilities, but we need to share the sovereignty in our decision-making on them. So with those thoughts, I would conclude by saying that I think at the end of these 20 years, we should rejoice more than we lament. There are still problems and there's a lot of unfinished business in Scotland. Donald said on the opening day, on the 1st of July, that we would make mistakes along the way, that we were not infallible, and he was absolutely right about that. But they have indeed been our mistakes, and that young Parliament has changed Scotland, and I certainly wish those who currently serve in it and will serve in it in the future very well. Thank you.